Hello and welcome everybody. We're going to start in a few minutes. And so please stay tuned. We'll be with you very shortly. Hello and welcome everybody. My name is Christoph Becker. I'm the director of the Digital Curation Institute in Toronto, and I welcome you all to the Digital Curation Institute's lecture today, both those in the room and those who follow online on our stream. So if you have dabbled in digital preservation, you will have come across tools like Jove and projects like Planets and initiatives like Data One, information sources, registries like the UDFR, consortia like the International Internet Preservation Consortium, or maybe file formats, PDF-A. And so one of the things they have in common is that Stephen Abrams was involved in some way or on the advisory board of these. And so it's great to have him here today. He's the Associate Director of the University of California Curation Center, the UC3, at the California Digital Library, where he carries responsibilities ranging from strategic planning, innovation, and technical oversight to the oversight of the UC3 services, systems, and collections. And so that covers initiatives for repositories, web archiving, data management, planning, data curation, and other things. And so these will be part of the talk, but the reason we invited him for the talk, in a sense, is a very, very interesting foundational piece that he produced in collaboration recently, a framework for foundations for curation that are much needed, we believe. And so many in digital preservation complain about the lack of clear conceptual foundations and the problems with terminology and ambiguities with what we actually mean with a digital object, as it's very much an undefined term. And so a lot of the analogies that we have break down when we talk about computation and digital objects and files and documents in that domain. And so Stephen will talk today about how the Foundations framework can help also an organization, a curation organization, to articulate more clearly what they do when we talk about digital curation. So please join me in welcoming Stephen Abrams. And so we're broadcasting the lecture. If you tweet, by the way, please use the hashtag DCI Toronto. And I will leave the stage now and over to Stephen.
Thank you, Christoph, for your kind invitation to come here to Toronto and speak at the Curation Institute on this recent work that we've done on trying to come up with a comprehensive model, a theoretically sound model for the curation domain. One preliminary note, this is a work that is still very much in progress. So I welcome the opportunity to present it to you and look forward to hearing your responses and comments and suggestions afterwards. Just had an opportunity to spend a little bit of time with Seamus earlier this afternoon, and already have a number of very promising avenues for extending our work in interesting areas. And I'm hopeful that you may have similar suggestions. As mentioned, I'm at the California Digital Library at the University of California. The CDL was founded as a central service unit back in 1997 to take advantage of then emerging technologies that were then and still are transforming in often very fundamental ways how information is being published, managed, and accessed at the University of California. In essence, we exist to support the university's core mission with regards to research, teaching, learning, and being a public institution, outreach to the citizens of California and even beyond that. As the University of California is a very expansive enterprise, spanning 10 campuses, 5 medical centers, several national libraries, offering over 600 graduate degree programs and over 230,000 students. As you can imagine, this means that we are dealing with the widest possible gamut of academic activities. One thing I probably should mention, however, is that CDL is not an academic unit. We are a service unit that was created initially to provide support to the campus library systems. Obviously, over time, we've sort of expanded our mission, but still, we're not academic in the sense that you are here, and mine is not an academic appointment. So to some extent, the work that I'll be presenting on is a little bit unusual for the way in which we generally tend to do things, very, very practically focused. But nevertheless, I feel it's really of great importance that all of our practical activities are firmly grounded in a strong theoretical basis. Organizationally, the CDL is broken out into 4 programmatic areas that support initiatives for open access publishing, digital special collections, collection licensing, mass digitization, shared cataloging, and other types of key bibliographic services. And in my unit, the UC Curation Center, we deal with providing effective stewardship for the information resources that are intrinsically bound up in the university's mission. And like all academic research libraries everywhere, I think, over these last few years, we've been grappling with questions of how to stay, how to be effective at our mission, how to remain relevant to the university community at large, all in the face of ongoing budgetary and staffing constraints. We also feel that we need to consider how best to respond to what we see as some very significant changes affecting the curation domain that have really come to fruition over the last couple of years. First off, the remarkable ease and ubiquity, or what I'm calling the democratization of content creation or acquisition, is a absolutely fundamentally disruptive transformation. While we think that we have a pretty good handle on dealing with changes of technology and being able to ameliorate that, there's something else that we have to deal with that also follows from this democratization, and that is, again, an absolutely fundamental disruptive change of audience and content. What do I mean by that? I mentioned earlier that the CDL was originally set up to serve the campus library systems, which meant that primarily we were dealing with materials that could be best characterized as cultural heritage. Digital texts, still images, recorded sound, a certain amount of moving image. But we were always dealing with information professionals, librarians, archivists, curators. That is now, well, we continue to still support the same audience, but now we have this whole new set of stakeholders. We are dealing with the widest possible range of outputs of scholarship, and we're also now dealing directly with faculty, students, and research staff. And that, as I said, is really quite profound, because I think we can no longer make implicit assumptions about shared understanding. You can't go into a room with our faculty and start talking about metadata and packaging schemes and persistent identifiers. They don't really care about that. While they are would be very happy and would welcome the results of good curation practices, they're not particularly interested in participating in those practices. They just, quite simply, they don't feel that that is their job. So we've taken this opportunity to enter a period of fairly intense introspection about what it is that we do, trying to consider what we feel we should be doing and how best we can do it in an efficient and effective manner. In doing so, our first inclination, of course, was to turn back to a number of the foundational instruments that we've been using for some time. So I'm thinking of various types of frameworks and modeling efforts, such as the OAIS reference model, the type of object modeling that is implicit to the premise metadata standard, various implications that come out of the track audit criteria and so forth. But the more that we looked into these things, the more we were becoming uneasy over the question of whether and how these old models would actually collectively cohere into a unified and comprehensive view of the curation domain. Why are we interested in that? We think that having a very solid and comprehensive model is absolutely important in order to ensure that all of our activities are being done in a very rigorous rather than an ad hoc fashion. But the more we went back and reviewed these things, the more we found that we were raising seemingly simple yet deceptively difficult to answer questions about quite what should be obvious things. What is digital curation? What is a digital object? And we came to this feeling that many of these key terms that we very freely bandy about remain woefully overloaded and under-formalized. So we have decided to move ahead with our own modeling effort, trying to be very careful in building it up incrementally from first principles to ensure that it remains consistent, yet conceptually parsimonious. So let's start with a couple of definitions. Here's the definition of digital curation that comes from the UK Digital Curation Center. Actually, their definition has changed somewhat significantly over time. This is the current thing that they say. And while this has the virtue of being very, very short and easily understandable, I think there are at least two things that are problematic with this. The first is I think there's this unnecessary qualification to research data. And research is particularly problematic because I think it still carries this unfortunate connotation as being scientific research. And therefore, it's being very exclusive when inclusivity is something to be greatly desired. The other thing I would call your attention to is this phrase on maintaining, preserving, and adding value to these digital assets. Well, these are certainly all laudable goals, but to me, they reflect a very technocratic view of curation activities. These, in essence, these are things that we as curation practitioners do, but there's no sense as to what the result of this is going to be. And perhaps even more significantly, there's absolutely no mention of the consumer, the person on whose behalf we are actually performing all these activities. So we have come up, excuse me, with an alternative formulation. It is a little bit longer and a bit more dense. And in the interest of time, I'm only going to try to highlight and unpack two of the key terms. But we consider digital curation to be a complex of actors, policies, practices, and technologies, enabling meaningful consumer engagement with authentic content of interest across barriers raised by space and time. So again, to highlight two things. What do I mean by content of interest? For me, content is of interest if it can be easily and readily distinguished from the larger universe of potential alternative content on the basis of consumer criteria. The second phrase is meaningful. What does that mean? What is a meaningful engagement? Content engagement is meaningful if it can be exploited successfully for some specific desired purpose. That purpose can be creative, making something new, additive, modifying something pre-existing, or consumptive. That purpose also should be able to be fulfilled at both a time and place and in a manner of the consumer's choosing, not my choosing as a curator, not the particular choosing or the intention of the content producer, but it's the content consumer. Because of that, I would argue that content engagement is always uniquely situated within the subjective context produced through curatorial framing and equally important, the consumer's experience, expertise, and expectation. Now I'd like to move on to this notion of a digital object, perhaps the term that most suffers from being overloaded and under-formalized. It, in essence, means everything and therefore means nothing. We did a review of various efforts going back a number of years now, looking at definitions of digital objects, certainly starting with Kahn and Lewinsky back in 1995. And we found that if you try to line them up against each other, as well as for some definitions of the more general notion of exchangeable information, such as the sender-receiver model, essentially Shannon as explicated by Schramm and Berlow, and Michael Buckland's information trichotomy, you can see that these things line up more or less along this, as we're showing here. And I think two things jump out from this particular diagram. One is that by counting up the number of rows, we can get a sense for the overall fineness of granularity with which these various efforts have attempted to decompose the notion of digital object. And secondly, we can see that there is no one formulation that is comprehensive, spanning all of the granules at their finest level. I leave the first row open, the first column open. As you could expect, that's where we are going to fill in with our modeling. I'd like to go back to this notion of content engagement. Engagement, I think, fundamentally entails the delivery of some unit of content to a consumer. How does that happen? If we consider the psychophysiological process, it goes something like this. An abstract unit of content is realized by a set of physical stimuli, which are perceived by a human sense modality, interpreted in a specific context, and ultimately experienced as cognitive meaning or psychological affect. In view of that final crucial transition from perception to cognition, I am going to argue very strongly that content consumption is an inherently semiotic act. Semiotics, of course, is the study of signs and sign systems, that is, things that carry meaning and the ways in which that meaning is codified, represented, and transmitted. Under the triadic theory of semiotics put forward by C.S. Peirce and later extended by Morris, a sign is something that stands in for something else, for someone in some manner. So once again, it's very important that one of the key semiotic principles is that an interpretation of a sign always takes place relative to the subjective contextual ground of the consumer's collateral experience, external to the sign itself. In signs, just as in digital objects, context really is everything. So I think that curation analysis can very profitably be done along 5 semiotic axes or dimensions. Semantics, which is concerned with the relationships that adhere between content and its underlying meaning or affect. Syntactics, the relationship between content and its symbolic representations. Empirics, a relationship with content's physical representations. Pragmatics, the relationship between content and the consumer experience of that content. And finally, dynamics, which is the relationship between the various states of content as it persists or evolves across space and time. Incidentally, the internal name, sept, that we use for our modeling effort comes from the approximate phonetic pronunciation of the acronym formed by those 5 semiotic dimensions. And in a bit of serendipity, it turns out that sept also is a genealogical term, somewhat obscure, but is used to refer to a group or subgrouping of a Scottish clan or family. So it actually seems to be quite apropos for a modeling effort that is looking at the decomposition of digital content and the relationships between the various decompositional layers. These 5 semiotic dimensions, I think, also might be look somewhat familiar to you because I think they really directly correspond to a number of long-standing stewardship concerns having to do with content's meaning, with its outer or morphological form and its inner structure, with its physical media, with the user experience, and with persistence. And finally, they also suggest a fairly straightforward ontological decomposition of a digital object into these components. We borrow this term noumenon from Kant, and we use that to refer to the underlying abstract meaning or affect of a piece of content. Noumenon in Kant's usage, well, and coming from the Greek actually, meaning that which is apprehended by the mind, in distinction to phenomenon, that which is apprehended by a sense. All of those 6 ontological components can be described through various types of propositional annotations. And we'll come to that in a little bit more detail in a moment. So referring back to our earlier table, we could see filling in our particular decomposed components: noumenon, inner and outer encodings, carriers, annotations, behaviors, ultimately resulting in stimuli, percept, which is the sort of the is referring to the uninterpreted sense image that results from perception. The very important subjective ground that provides contextualization, and finally the interpretation, the experience of meaning or affect. How can we then use this? We can also apply these same principles to defining a hierarchical typology of increasing content utility. So we can start at the most general sense, the most general configuration of undifferentiated bits living on some sort of digital carrier. This is what we would call a digital entity, about which we could say almost nothing, other than the fact that it exists as a digital thing. But because it is completely opaque, its value is nascent. However, we could start to add, incrementally add additional bits of information, and we'll start to climb up this ladder of increasingly utile objects. So what is sort of the first fundamental bit of information that we could add to these bits? I would argue that it is the notion of identity. This sort of primary action of identity that demarcates and distinguishes one particular set of bits, essentially fixed at some particular point in digital space-time, from the wider universe. But until we have that identity, we have nothing tangible that we can really get our hands on and use as the focus for further curation focus. So we would call an artifact, a digital artifact, is an intentional entity. There was created through an explicit act of commission. But again, since at this point it is still both syntactically and semantically opaque, I would say that it is of only incipient value. However, by going one more rung up the ladder, adding type characterization, we get to what we're calling a digital article, which is a purposeful artifact. Typing implies syntactic transparency, so we start to be able to discern what the underlying purpose of this particular article might be. But again, still semantically opaque, so it is as of yet, only of potential value. If we start to add some descriptive semantics, we achieve what we're calling a digital commodity. That is a meaningful article. But since at this point we have no direct means of exploiting it for a particular purpose, its value remains theoretical until we add in the notion of behaviors, realizing behaviors that are able to turn these sets of bits back into those physical stimuli that is then accessible to a human consuming agent. This amalgamation we call a digital asset. It is a useful commodity, and because it can be directly exploited, it is of practical value. And then finally, if we can put into place some necessary series of intervening actions that are ameliorating the effects of noise across time and space, we achieve what we're calling a digital heirloom, which is a reliable asset. And to the extent to which those preservation actions are successful, it is of enduring value. So here is full progression with reference back to the underlying semiotic dimensions and the various ontological components. In the interest of time, I'm only going to be able to touch on a couple of other aspects of our full modeling effort. I'll have a URL later on where you can go to a white paper that goes into much more detail over the entire model. But in addition to looking at content and object modeling, we've also attempted to go in and model this notion of content engagement. And we do that by focusing on three particular roles, that of producer, manager, and consumer, and three loci of concerns: production, management, and consumption. And all of these are orthogonal to what we're calling these three dimensions that exist within a continuum. And we prefer to talk about a continuum of activities rather than a life cycle, because we think it better expresses the notion of the inherently nonlinear and interconnected and overlapping nature of these types of activities. I think it's probably safe to say that many of us as curation practitioners, those of us working in libraries and archives, have probably tended to focus much more on that central block, or perhaps the middle row. But in fact, I think if we want to remain effective and relevant bodies within our institutions, it's important that we make very positive efforts towards supporting activities over this entire continuum. Another thing that we have looked at is the notion of strategy and policy. And in this area, we've sort of tried to wrap everything up into these 6 high-level imperatives. One preliminary imperative, predilect, dealing with decisions you make about what you intend to do, and then 5 further sort of implementational imperatives. Collect, obtain what you intend; protect, preserve what you obtain; introspect, know what you protect; project, offer what you know; and finally, connect, deliver what you offer. Each of those imperatives can be applied against all of the ontological entities that we had defined a little bit earlier. And once again, this is a very dense presentation that I suspect you may have a little bit of difficulty in reading. So I'll just highlight one particular aspect of this, looking at that protect imperative as it applies to entities, artifacts, articles, commodities, assets, and heirlooms. I think that this corresponds very strongly to these types of concerns regarding environmental control when you're dealing at the media level, administrative control when you're dealing with purely opaque bits of content, technical control when you start to have some syntactic transparency, bibliographic control at the level of semantic transparency, access control when we start to talk about executable behaviors, and then finally change control when we're dealing with the effects of changes over time. So where does this all get us? Well, I think if nothing else, this type of vocabulary, very granular vocabulary, and hopefully unambiguous vocabulary, can be used to make precise yet concise statements about curation intention and results. For example, it's very common if you go around and look at various preservation programs, statements of their service level agreements and so forth, you'll get this, there's this notion of preservation levels of obligation. Typically, it tends to be a binary thing, and generally they're called something like this. Almost everyone calls the first level bit level, and then I think we all have a fairly good understanding of what we mean by that. But then there's this other thing, functional, full preservation, a variety of terms that are widely used, none of which are very well defined at all. I mean, what does that actually mean? If we go and try to translate this into this technical language that we're introducing in our SEP model, we can see that bit level preservation corresponds to questions of ensuring what I would call, the morphological integrity of artifacts. And as we move up, we can see that we can accept an obligation, for example, with regard to structural integrity, semantic integrity, behavioral integrity, and now we have well-defined labels that we can attach to those things. So we can, in fact, make a much better statement of what it is that we're prepared to accept. As an example, I won't go through to read this. This is our old preservation policy at the CDL, and it's a fairly lengthy narrative, and it does more or less a good job, but we can translate this into this more unambiguous language of the SEP model. It's a little bit longer, but again, I think we've tried to squeeze out all the ambiguity, so it's very clear what we're prepared to do, and our customers have a very clear understanding of what their expectations should be. I think the other thing that is useful from this type of modeling effort is that it does help to move us forward towards this goal of having a very firm foundation, theoretical and conceptual foundation for all of our activities. So if I can quickly try to summarize this, I think it is very important that any curation program is able to make fully informed decisions, both to allocate or withhold resources and to perform or forego activities. In making those types of decisions, it is always best to do that with reference to a comprehensive model of the underlying domain, in this case of the curation domain. As I mentioned at the beginning, having a very strong reference domain model helps to ensure that curation analysis and other types of activities are performed on a rigorous rather than ad hoc fashion. It helps to give us all a greater degree of confidence that we have considered all of the implications of what it is we're choosing to do or potentially not do. I believe that semiotics provides a very helpful theoretical or conceptual framework for producing such a model, because it gives us a great deal of help in teasing out a number of these very important nuanced distinctions with regard to object modeling, the modeling of consumer engagement, and these other types of activities. We're hopeful that the model that we proposed can play a role as one of these reference domain models. We are certainly moving ahead with using it for the planning and evaluation of our internal systems and activities. In particular, we're at a stage where we need to replace our current preservation and access repository. It was a homegrown system. It's about 10 years old at this point. It's definitely showing its age. We found the modeling that we've gone through here to be very, very helpful in letting us come up with a very comprehensive set of functional requirements and acceptance criteria as we move forward in that effort. So I will end up here, and I would be very eager to hear what responses you may have had and answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. So we'll definitely have time for questions. And also I'm going to change the characteristics here a little so that we can hear us all. Any other questions before I have some ideas here? Any questions?
I have many, many questions.
Yes.
But I don't want to, but the students are going to, yeah, come on.
Okay, I noticed that a lot of the terminology that you're using throughout this process is very, sort of puts me in mind of economics, like there's assets and commodities.
Yes.
Was that intentional? Because I think there is a little bit of a difference between how we use information and how we use money. So could you just kind of talk about the choice of words and yeah, what the relationship or some of the differences are, and why you chose such sort of economic language?
Yeah, that had not occurred to me before, but I now as you say it does sort of jump out. That was certainly not our intention to do that. We did spend quite a lot of time thinking about the terminology, and we were trying to be very, very careful as we name things, both to help to ensure that these things remain unambiguous, and that whatever inevitable connotations carried by these terms, that it seemed to be appropriate for the thing at hand. So, for example, you have a distinction between a commodity and an asset. I mean, as I recall, maybe in a certain sense, we did have that sort of economic metaphor in mind, but because, a commodity is meaningful but not directly useful, we were thinking of it in terms of, the raw material, whereas the asset is something that is directly exploitable for a particular purpose, and that therefore it is the thing of value. And to my mind, an asset was something of greater value than the commodity. But yeah, very, very interesting observation.
I was going to say, I just could probably react about consumers in that same vein. And I'm sure there's a good reason why you call them consumers. I don't imagine. I know that.
Yeah, I'm trying to think.
Anyway, I think that was one of my questions. Was also what made you call these people consumers?
Yeah, I think it again was to draw the widest possible distinction with producer.
But it's interesting because at the beginning of your presentation, what you alluded to, and I think it's true, that our traditional consumers have become the generators of a lot of this data, and that those boundaries, and that's one of the reasons with the OIS model starts to break down, because it has, the generator here, and then it has the designated communities over here, as though they're different. But you're saying that one of the, and even who the steward is changing.
Yes.
Right? So anyway, that's just.
Our intention was certainly to use those labels for roles, not necessarily for individuals or organizations, recognizing that the role is a fluid association, and that any given individual or agent will probably hold a variety of roles at different points in time, or even a variety of roles at the same time, but depending on what particular activity he or she might be focused on, he or she would be acting with respect to one particular role.
It's actually a related question that also came up, especially considering that a lot is about perception and cognition. What about non-human actors, especially also as consumers?
We certainly don't mean to discount that, but to my mind, the ultimate agency in all these activities always is going to reside, in a human actor. And even if there, is a great deal of technological intermediation, something at some point is getting reported back to that human actor. So the notion of machine intermediation, it's somewhat tied up in that. Well, it is tied up in the notion, of talking about behavior, which again we chose that term to be, to hopefully cover the widest possible notion of what is required to make this transition from the digital back into our analog world of the ultimate human consumer.
And so, talking about transitions, can you say a little bit about what you anticipate to be the transition of this model in practice, and what kind of barriers you might imagine?
Well, in terms of barriers, I think there's a lot of barriers that will be thrown up to this. Even within my own organization, there was a certain amount of, not pushback, but a certain amount of questioning the level, of effort that's gone into this to produce this work. I've had to answer quite a number of questions from my colleagues, as to why is this really important. Of course, I as mentioned throughout, this is really a fundamental importance, that we really can't get on to the, these practical things. That's our primary focus, unless we are reasonably sure that they are well grounded in in conceptual theory. Because once again, if we don't do that, then we're operating in an ad hoc manner rather than a truly rigorous manner, and it would be much more likely that we are going to forget about something, or we are going to move forward on the basis of unstated assumptions and other types of difficulties that might be raised that way. So I think what we're proposing here, it's new, it's different. There's a lot of new terminology in here. There's new terminology even for older things that had some older terms. Although I would argue, for the most part, those older terms were not as well and unambiguously defined as we're trying to do here. This whole approach is permeated with this notion of semiotic theory, something that comes very naturally to me from my academic training as an art historian, not being a librarian. When we're moving out into the world of practitioners, that again may seem a little bit unusual, something that's not quite as familiar to people. So I think there's a good deal that we might have to try to overcome. But I certainly, hopefully we as an organization have been finding this very useful along the lines that I was talking about earlier. This does give us the ability to talk about our intentions, our policies, our strategies with a great deal more of clarity and concision than we could do before. And I think that is very, very important to help to set the expectations of our stakeholder communities.
It seems that it provides a lot more clear articulation of a lot of the things that we're trying to tear apart and very often fail to do so because we just have this one word, digital object,
We use it for the files, and we use it for the bits, and we use it for the documents, and we use it for the concepts and for the semantics. But it does require, so to say, then the adoption of a new vocabulary in conceptual framework. And I think it seems a very worthwhile effort to make that effort to adopt it, but also a quest of education a bit ahead to make sure that this is actually successfully adopted.
Yeah.
I have a small question. If I remember correctly, in your definition, you said curation. Can we go to the beginning where you?
Sure.
Your definition, not the. Okay, so you say that digital curation is a complex of actors, policy practices, that enables meaningful consumer engagement. The reason I asked, okay, so I wanted to go to there. You actually don't, when you have all your various models, you have the bet and you add to it, you don't use the word meaningful, you use the word usable. And the reason I ask, I did my PhD on the FITS project, which was looking at what was a record and what was it, what did you need for reliable evidence in the 90s. So, and we differentiated between an object that's meaningful and an object that's usable. And so my question is, are you, in here you use meaningful, but you don't use meaningful in your various configurations of your object, and you use the word usable. So is usable and meaningful the same? Are they different? Is there a semantic difference?
Well, later on, when actually we do use meaningful, a commodity is a meaningful article, and an asset is a useful commodity. So we are again drawing a distinction between something which is fully semantically transparent from something that is semantically transparent, but that has an associated set of behaviors that help to realize and transmit the underlying meaning or affect. But I'm seeing what I'm saying here, what I'm noticing, again, a very keen observation is, we're using the word meaningful here in a different manner, and perhaps we should find a different word because we did try to ensure that this technical vocabulary that we used each term once to mean one thing.
The PIP project used the word understandable,
Understand.
which would mean that it could be rendered and people could understand it.
Yes.
And I guess the other thing about meaningful is, the whole theory that meaning and it would be, the author is dead, and that the consumer is the one who gives it meaning.
Yeah, absolutely.
And anyway, so and my only final comment had to do with the way you look at context, because archives look at context so differently. And in your chart, you connected, I think, well, I guess I should go to it since I was wrong about meaningful later, but you had context related to knowledge base. So are you assuming, when you look at the library literature, they look at context and they assume context is the context of the user or consumer. And when archivists use the word context, they very much, from the very earliest projects looking at the idea of digital record, the context was something you had to preserve across time to make the record understandable. So I wonder in what way, so I was troubled by this concept of context. My sense is that you were using it in sort of a library sense and not acknowledge, and as an archivist, we always must bring forward our sense of things.
And it's very possible that I am doing that. As I mentioned, by training, I'm a mathematician and art historian.
Right.
I think I've learned quite a bit about libraries being embedded in the library now for going on 20 years. I have much lower level of familiarity with the archival work and archival practice. This is actually something that came up when I was talking to Seamus earlier today.
Well, the closest would be for an art historian is the provenance of the
Provenance, yeah.
and that's partially captures the concept of context.
Right.
But not the way.
Yeah, so I mean, I did, again, in the interest of time, I didn't really go into that in any real detail. I can, certainly refer you back to the white paper.
It's just Seamus, Christoph sent me the.
Right.
And I did look at the link, but I didn't get it further.
Sure. But there is an extended section on there talking about contexts, contexts, because of course there are many contexts with respect to the authorial intention of the producer. There's the curatorial context that is implied by what we could call the archival arrangement of the thing, its placement within a larger collection. It's being made available under the aegis of a stewarding organization that has reputational qualities to it, and of course, obviously, the subjective ground or context that the consumer always brings to the notion of interpretation.
Yeah, I guess it's sort of, and that's where, I think this work is great, but it's so difficult when you sort of map it, because then you're like, when you say you have context here, and then you have ground, and that gives a certain connotation to that meaning of context, and it loses much of that nuance, and whether you need the context 1, 2, 3, 4, the context here maps to here.
Yes.
The context 1, 2, and 3 do not.
Sure. Yes, and certainly, I could see how it's very easily that those very diagrammatic depictions could be seen to imply a much tighter and direct relationship between those things. I mean, it's a little bit, I think, more fluid than that. But we were trying to show, the rough way in which those things tend to line up, or at least what are sort of the conceptual centers of gravity that seem to have an association between them. But it's, again, very good point, and I would be eager to learn more about, the archival view of the world and trying to bring that into.
Just stay around here, because we're always trying to show you how to point you, right?
I actually just received another question by email from Arsen Ivanov, and he's asking a great question. He would like to know a bit more, was the model developed to be implementation independent the way that Premise is and OAS is, or did you develop it with a very specific type of curation content in mind? So for example, humanities and social science data or so. If the latter is the case, could you tell us a little more about the types of material that you collect and curate? I would add just myself, I don't think OAS is very implementation independent, but it's a different side.
Yes, this is intended to be a domain model. It is intended to try to provide a stable set of definitions for the core concepts that underlie the field and its activities. So in that sense, it is not intended to be particular to any particular mode of implementation. We try to be very careful in creating this as to make it applicable to the widest range of content, both in terms of genre, academic discipline, and so forth. And I don't believe that there is anything really in there that might tend to imply the contrary.
There's one thing that maybe you can unpack that a little bit, and I think you say that it focuses on content reducible to factual truth claims, right?
No, I'd say it is not. That's when we're talking about the basic representation model, the BRM, that came out of Illinois, and that's a very interesting model because it had a very interesting three-level hierarchy of I'm trying to call it, it's the abstract thing, or what they call propositional content, a series of nested encodings, and then finally the outer representation. So there was we were able to steal quite a number of of interesting things from that work, but we did not want to carry over that term propositional content because in terms of its literal meaning, it is talking about only content that is related to factual truth claims. In the context in which that model was created, which was dealing with preservation of scientific materials, that made perfect sense. But that's the one reason why we use that somewhat obscure term noumenon to refer to sort of the ineffable essence of the content. Because in its Kantian sense, that's precisely what that is referring to. Both factual claims as well as other types of creative content or other types of things where the intention or the effect is one of producing some direct impact on psychological state.
Any questions? Of course, we have an estimated 300 further questions, but I think we'll continue discussing them later today and for the rest of your visit. So thanks again. Thanks a lot for a fantastic talk and great conversation. Very inspiring. And thanks also to all who came and to all who joined in online. Greetings out there. And thanks especially to Steve.
Thank you.